The month is December, in the year 1682. Deep within the Palace of Versailles, a profound silence has fallen over the Hall of Mirrors. The hundreds of courtiers who filled this space with noise and color have long since retired to their apartments, leaving behind only the lingering scent of perfume and beeswax. Thousands of candles still burn, their flames crackling softly, their light captured and multiplied into infinity by 357 Venetian mirrors. This grand corridor, stretching 73 meters in length, becomes a labyrinth of light and shadow, where the gilded ceiling celebrating the king's glories is reflected in the polished parquet floor below. It is a space designed to overwhelm, to display the absolute power of France. But in the quiet hours after midnight, when the guards stand motionless at either end, the hall serves another, more clandestine purpose. It becomes a theater of whispers, a stage for transactions the official histories would never record. In the center of this luminous void stands Louis XIV, 44 years of age, and at the absolute apex of his power. He is not in his ceremonial wig or formal attire. Instead, his own thinning hair is visible, a rare glimpse of the man behind the carefully constructed icon of the Sun King. His gaze is distant, calculating, as he watches the Duc de Vivonne, brother to his official mistress, present a young woman. She is no older than 16, her face pale under the candlelight, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and terror. Her silk dress rustles with every shallow breath she takes, her bodice laced so tightly it seems to constrict her very soul. The air is thick with unspoken words, the tension palpable in the vast empty space. The king says nothing, his expression unreadable as he appraises the girl before him, a silent negotiation hanging in the air. He raises a hand, not in a gesture of welcome but of assessment, gently touching the young woman's chin to force her gaze to meet his. In his eyes, there is no passion, none of the fire of desire, only the cold appraisal of a master craftsman examining a tool. He is measuring her family's ambition, her potential value, the exact price of his royal favor. To the rest of Europe, this hall was the grand stage for diplomacy and celebration, a symbol of French magnificence. But after the ambassadors departed and the music faded, it transformed into something else entirely, a marketplace, a place where fortunes were built, political alliances were cemented, and the fate of the nation's most powerful families was decided, not with treaties or edicts, but with the silent offering of human bodies. A single silent tear escapes the young woman's eye, a fleeting detail visible only in her distorted reflection. If you believe that history is found not just in textbooks, but in the secret corridors and unspoken truths behind the facades of power, then subscribe to this channel. We are dedicated to uncovering these forgotten narratives. Your support, by leaving a like on this video, helps these meticulously researched stories reach a wider audience of curious minds. We are a global community, united by a passion for the real, unvarnished past, so please share in the comments where you are watching from today. This story is not merely a palace scandal, it is an examination of a forbidden system, a complex game of sex and power engineered by a master manipulator. To understand how this system was built and how it operated, we must first journey back to understand the mind of the man who conceived it, the king who turned his own desires into an instrument of absolute control. To truly comprehend the forbidden system that operated within the walls of Versailles, one must first understand the man who was its architect, its centerpiece and its absolute master. He was born Louis de Bourbon on September 5, 1638, in the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye. As the long-awaited heir to King Louis XIII and Anne of Austria, his birth was hailed as a divine gift to France, earning him the name Louis Dieudonné, or Louis the God-given. This belief in his own divinely ordained status would shape his entire existence. He ascended to the throne at the age of 4 and would go on to reign for 72 years and 110 days, the longest of any major monarch in European history. His personal fortune was indistinguishable from the state treasury of France, the wealthiest nation in Europe, granting him resources that were effectively infinite. The defining event of his youth and the psychological key to his entire reign was a series of civil wars known as the Fronde. From 1648 to 1653, while Louis was still a boy, the French nobility rose in rebellion against the crown. He experienced profound humiliation and fear, at one point having a Parisian mob break into his royal bedchamber to stare at him as he feigned sleep. This was not an abstract political lesson. It was a deeply personal trauma that instilled in him a permanent and profound distrust of the aristocracy. He learned a brutal lesson. The nobility were not his partners but his rivals, a perpetual threat that had to be domesticated and controlled. This singular obsession would become the foundational principle upon which he would build his monarchy and his palace. His response to this formative chaos was to impose an unprecedented level of order and control on every aspect of his life. He transformed his daily routines into elaborate public rituals. The lever, his waking ceremony, and the coucher, his retiring ceremony, were attended by dozens of the highest-ranking nobles who vied for the honor of handing him his shirt or holding his candle. By making his most intimate moments a state spectacle, he erased the very concept of a private life for the monarch. Every minute of his day was scheduled, every action performed before an audience. This relentless choreography served a dual purpose. It reinforced his divine, sun-like centrality to the court, and it turned the lives of his nobles into a constant, anxious performance of servitude, leaving no room for conspiracy. This obsession with control was matched by appetites that were equally monarchical in scale, seen by the court not as a vice, but as a sign of royal vitality and power. He was a famous glutton, capable of consuming enormous quantities of food at his public dinners. His energy for the hunt was seemingly inexhaustible, and his sexual appetite was perhaps the most voracious of all. He viewed the conquest of women in the same light as the conquest of territory, as a natural expression of his divinely ordained authority and virility. He fathered at least 21 children, of whom only 6 were with his long-suffering wife Queen Maria Theresa. For Louis, desire was never just personal. It was an extension of his dominion, another realm in which to demonstrate his absolute sovereignty over all he surveyed. Yet, these passions were always governed by a cold, calculating pragmatism. Louis XIV was capable of separating personal affection from political utility with terrifying clarity. His mistresses were far more than objects of desire. They were strategic assets in the great game of court politics. He elevated them, showered their families with titles and wealth, and used their positions to monitor the shifting allegiances of the court. In a masterstroke of political engineering, he legitimized the children he had with his most powerful mistress, the Marquise de Montespan. By marrying these legitimized offspring into the highest branches of the royal family, he wove a new web of loyalty, a dynasty of his own making, bound to him not just by favor but by his own blood. The meticulous nature of his control was perfectly captured by the memoirist Duc de Saint-Simon, a nobleman who observed the court with a critical eye. Saint-Simon famously wrote, "With an almanac and a watch, one could, from 300 leagues away, say with accuracy what he was doing." This was not an exaggeration. The king's life was so regimented that it functioned with the precision of a clockwork mechanism. This predictability was a weapon. In a world where all power, wealth, and status flowed directly from the king's favor, this rigid schedule forced thousands of courtiers to synchronize their entire existence to his. His routine became the inescapable rhythm of their lives, compelling their constant attention and leaving them with neither the time nor the privacy to plot against him. This entire system required a specific stage, one built for the purpose. His motivation for constructing the Palace of Versailles began with his deep-seated hatred for Paris. He associated the city with the chaos and humiliation of the Fronde, its narrow streets with rebellious mobs, and its royal palaces like the Louvre with vulnerability. The modest hunting lodge of his father at Versailles, situated in an isolated rural location, offered the perfect escape. It was a blank slate upon which he could design and build a new world from scratch, a self-contained universe entirely of his own making. The move from Paris was not merely a change of address. It was a strategic retreat to a fortress of his own design, far from the dangers of his past. Versailles was conceived as the ultimate projection of power. Its unprecedented scale and unimaginable luxury were intended as a declaration to the world of the supremacy of the French monarchy. Every hall, every fountain, Every painting was a carefully crafted piece of propaganda designed to awe, impress and intimidate visiting ambassadors and subjugated nobles alike. It was meant to establish France as the undisputed cultural and political center of the universe, with Louis himself, the Sun King, as its radiant core. The palace was not merely a residence, it was a diplomatic weapon, a theater of magnificence where the sheer spectacle of French gloire, or glory, would overwhelm any potential rival and silence any internal dissent before it could even be spoken. Beyond its opulent facade, the very architecture of Versailles was a sophisticated instrument of control. The palace was designed with a deliberate duality. The grand state apartments and the Hall of Mirrors were the public stage for the performance of power. But interwoven throughout this official space was a second hidden palace, a complex network of private apartments, secret passages, and service staircases known as dégagements. This hidden circulatory system allowed the king and his chosen few to move through the palace unseen, facilitating the secret intrigues that were the true currency of the court. Most symbolically, the king's own bedroom was placed at the exact geographical center of the entire sprawling complex, a constant architectural reminder that all life, all power, and all access revolved exclusively around him. To fully grasp how this system functioned, one must recognize the political reality Louis had engineered. He was the living embodiment of absolute monarchy, a concept perfectly captured by the phrase attributed to him, "L'État c'est moi." I am the state. His power was nearly absolute. With a simple sealed letter, a lettre de cachet, he could imprison any subject for any reason without trial. He had systematically dismantled the regional military and political power of the French nobility, forcing them to abandon their ancestral lands and attend his court at Versailles. Here, stripped of their traditional sources of authority, their survival and prosperity depended entirely on a single factor: securing the king's personal favor in a relentlessly competitive, paranoid, and public arena. Thus, all the elements were in place. A monarch forged by the trauma of civil war, driven by a pathological need for control, and armed with the wealth of a nation and the doctrine of divine right. He possessed a prodigious personal appetite that he saw as an extension of his political power, and a cold, pragmatic intellect that allowed him to turn human desire into a tool of statecraft. Versailles was the inevitable result of this unique confluence of personality, power, and history. It would be more than a home. It would be a gilded cage, a magnificent machine designed to reflect his glory and to bend the most powerful men and women in France to his will. The construction of this palace was the construction of the system itself. The transformation of a modest royal hunting lodge into the most magnificent palace in Europe began in earnest in the year 1661. Driven by his vision of absolute control, Louis XIV enlisted the architect Louis Leveau to begin the first major expansion. This initial phase was but a prelude to the grand symphony of construction that would follow. From 1668 to 1678, a second, far more ambitious phase reshaped the landscape itself. Rivers were diverted, hills were leveled, and entire forests were planted to create the proper setting for the Sun King's new universe. This was not merely construction. It was an act of creation, a monarch imposing his will, not just on his subjects, but on the very earth beneath his feet, forging a world that would reflect his own perceived divinity and power. The principal architect of the palace's most iconic features was Jules Hardouin Mansart, a master of the French Baroque style, who took command of the project in 1678. Under his direction, the palace expanded to its colossal dimensions, with the addition of the north and south wings, and most famously the Hall of Mirrors. Hardouin Mansart understood the king's true intention. This was to be architecture as political statement. Every line, every gilded molding, every vast, intimidating space was designed to communicate a single, unambiguous message of French supremacy and the unassailable authority of its monarch. The final complex would sprawl across more than 2,000 acres, containing 2,300 rooms, a structure so vast it functioned less as a home and more as a self-contained city dedicated to the worship of its king. The cost of this monumental undertaking was, by any measure, staggering and almost impossible to comprehend. Reliable estimates placed the total expenditure at around 100 million livres tournois. To put this figure in perspective, some historians calculate that during the peak years of construction, the palace consumed as much as 25% of France's entire annual state revenue. In modern terms, this equates to a sum in the hundreds of billions of dollars. This was a fortune that could have funded entire wars, built fleets of ships, or fed the kingdom's poor for a generation. Instead, it was poured into stone, marble, and gold, a conscious decision by Louis to prioritize the tangible projection of his glory over any other concern of the state, because in his mind, he and the state were one and the same. This architectural wonder was built upon the labor and lives of a veritable army. At the height of construction, as many as 36,000 workers and artisans toiled on the site, a temporary city of craftsmen, masons, and laborers rising from the swamps of Versailles. The conditions were notoriously dangerous, with accidents and disease claiming an untold number of lives. There are accounts of high mortality rates, with workers falling from scaffolding or succumbing to fevers in the marshy terrain. This creates a stark and brutal contrast. The immaculate geometric perfection of the finished palace, a symbol of order and civilization, was brought into being through the chaotic, often lethal, and largely unrecorded suffering of thousands of anonymous men whose sweat and blood were mixed into the very mortar of its foundation. The genius of the landscape designer André Le Nôtre extended this philosophy of absolute control beyond the palace walls. The gardens of Versailles are not a celebration of nature, but a demonstration of humanity's, and specifically the king's, dominion over it. Le Nôtre imposed a rigid geometric order upon the landscape, with perfectly straight avenues, meticulously clipped hedges, and mathematically precise patterns. The vast network of fountains, an engineering marvel for its time, further symbolized the king's power to command the very elements. For a courtier strolling through these gardens, the message was inescapable. If the king could bend nature itself to his will, forcing it into such perfect and unnatural symmetry, what chance did a mere nobleman have of resisting his authority? The gardens were an extension of the palace's political purpose. At the heart of the palace's design was a deliberate and crucial duality, a separation between the public and private spheres of the king's existence. The official state apartments, or the grand apartment, comprised a series of 7 opulent salons, each dedicated to a classical deity, culminating in the Apollo Salon, the throne room. This was the public stage, a magnificent processional route where the rituals of court life were performed and where the king displayed his power to ambassadors and subjects alike. Every evening, this space hosted the apartment, a formal gathering with music and gambling. It was a world of rigid etiquette and constant performance, where every action was observed and every word was weighed, a theater of absolute monarchy in full, glorious operation. Beyond this public facade lay the king's inner sanctum, the petit appartement. These were the private rooms of Louis XIV, and access to them was the most coveted and fiercely contested prize at court. To be invited into these chambers meant you had transcended the role of a mere spectator and had been admitted into the king's personal orbit. This was not a space designed for comfort or relaxation in the modern sense. It was the nerve center of the kingdom, the true seat of power where decisions were made, alliances were forged, and favors were granted. The very layout of these rooms, a series of interconnected antechambers and studies, was a physical map of the court's hierarchy, with one's proximity to the king's bedchamber defining one's influence and status. To facilitate the secret life of the court, the palace was riddled with a hidden network of service corridors, narrow spiral staircases, and concealed doors known as dégagements. This was the building's secret circulatory system, allowing the king, his family, his servants, and his most trusted visitors to move throughout the vast structure unseen. These passages were not just a matter of convenience. They were essential to the functioning of the political and social system Louis had created. Famously, a discreet staircase was built to connect the king's own apartments directly to those of his primary mistress, which were located on the floor immediately above his. This architectural choice is a stark and unambiguous testament to the importance of the forbidden system in the king's daily life. The most spectacular space in the entire palace, the Hall of Mirrors, perfectly embodies this duality of purpose. Stretching 73 meters in length, its official function was to serve as a grand passageway connecting the king's and queen's state apartments. It was a space for grand receptions and diplomatic audiences, a place designed to stun foreign envoys into submission with its sheer opulence. Its 17 arched windows overlooking the gardens were matched by 357 mirrors of Venetian glass, a material so expensive it was considered a treasure of state. The hall was a weapon of diplomacy, a glittering gallery of French power, its ceiling painted by Charles Le Brun with scenes celebrating the glorious triumphs of the king's reign. Yet, for the members of the court, the Hall of Mirrors served a far more intimate and dangerous purpose. Its genius for the forbidden system lay in its semi-public nature and its unique optical properties. It was the primary arena to see and be seen, where the mirrors created an environment of total surveillance. Nothing could go unnoticed. A subtle glance from the king, a shared smile, a brief touch of the hand, all were amplified and observed from 100 different angles. After the official ceremonies ended and the crowds thinned, it was here in the shimmering candlelight that the silent negotiations of power took place. It was the perfect stage for the opening moves of the game, a place where invitations to the private world were offered and accepted before the affair moved behind closed doors. The palace's innovations were also marshaled in service of this dual existence. The ability to illuminate the grand halls with thousands of wax candles, a ruinously expensive commodity, was in itself a display of unimaginable wealth. This control over light allowed the atmosphere to be shifted instantly from one of overwhelming public spectacle to one of intimate conspiratorial shadow. Furthermore, the construction methods of the era, with thick stone walls, heavy wooden doors, and layers of rich tapestries hanging on every surface, provided a remarkable degree of soundproofing. This acoustic insulation was not accidental. It was essential for ensuring that the sensitive conversations, secret negotiations, and intimate encounters that took place within the private apartments remained entirely confidential, preserving the secrecy upon which the entire system depended. By the 6th of May in the year 1682, the palace was deemed sufficiently complete to fulfill its ultimate destiny. On that day, Louis XIV officially moved his court and the entire government of France from Paris to Versailles. This was not a simple change of royal residence. It was a forced migration, a summons that the nobility could not refuse. Thousands of the most powerful men and women in the kingdom abandoned their ancestral chateaux and regional power bases to take up residence in the cramped apartments of the new palace. The magnificent stage, built of stone and secrets, was finally finished. The actors, a captive audience of aristocrats, were now in place. The gilded cage had closed its doors, and the complex human drama of the Sun King's court was about to begin. To operate this magnificent machine required a human infrastructure on an unprecedented scale. The royal household, or the Maison du Roi, employed approximately 10,000 individuals, a population equivalent to a sizable French city. This included soldiers for the King's Guard, officials for the government ministries housed within the palace, and a vast army of servants, cooks, gardeners, and artisans. Of these, around 5,000 people lived and worked directly within the palace walls, a permanent city dedicated to service. In addition to this staff, the resident nobility fluctuated but could reach another 5,000 souls, all crammed into apartments of varying size and comfort. Versailles was therefore not a home in any conventional sense. It was a self-contained universe, a bustling, hierarchical society where every individual, from the highest duke to the lowliest scullion, understood their place in the rigid orbit around the Sun King. The rhythm of this universe was dictated by a daily routine of almost religious solemnity, a clockwork of ceremony that began precisely at 8:30 in the morning. This was the hour of the lever, the king's waking ceremony. It was a highly ritualized performance divided into 6 parts, with entry granted based on rank. The most powerful nobles of the realm would compete for the honor of witnessing the king emerge from his bed, handing him his shirt or offering him his wig. This was not a matter of personal service, but of profound political significance. To be present at the lever was a public declaration of one's standing. By transforming his most intimate morning rituals into a state spectacle, Louis XIV immediately established the day's hierarchy, reminding every courtier that their status was entirely dependent on their proximity to his person, even at his most vulnerable moments. Following the morning's rituals, the King's Day unfolded with the same relentless public choreography. At 10 o'clock he would lead a procession to the royal chapel for Mass, his every step observed by hundreds of courtiers lining the Hall of Mirrors. Council meetings with his ministers consumed the late morning, followed by dinner at 1 o'clock. This was not a private meal, but another public performance, where the king often ate alone at a table set before an audience of nobles. The afternoons were typically reserved for a walk in the gardens or a hunt, activities that were both a display of his physical vigor and an opportunity for informal petitioning. The day concluded as it began with the coucher, the public retiring ceremony, at 11:30 at night, a mirror image of the lever, once again reinforcing the inescapable theatricality of royal life. The evenings at Versailles were dominated by the apartment, a formal gathering held several times a week in the grand apartments of the king. From 7 to 10 in the evening, these opulent salons were thrown open to the court. Music, provided by composers like Jean-Baptiste Lully, would fill the air as hundreds of nobles circulated, conversed, and most importantly, gambled. Card games were a central feature, often involving ruinously high stakes that could make or break a family's fortune in a single night. These events were a masterclass in controlled social interaction. While appearing relaxed, every courtier was acutely aware of the rigid etiquette, the unspoken rules of conduct, and the constant piercing gaze of the king who would move through the rooms, his briefest glance or word capable of defining a career. The cost of maintaining this daily spectacle was astronomical, a constant drain on the French treasury. The sheer logistics of feeding thousands of residents and staff required a city's worth of supplies to be brought to the palace daily. Illuminating the vast halls for an evening apartment required thousands of expensive beeswax candles, a luxury beyond the reach of all but the wealthiest citizens. The king's table was laden with exotic delicacies, and the wine cellars were stocked with the finest vintages. In an era when a skilled laborer might earn 150 livres in an entire year, the annual budget for the royal household ran into the millions. This colossal expenditure was not seen as waste, but as a necessary investment in the projection of power, a tangible demonstration of the king's glory and the bottomless wealth of his kingdom. To the outside world and to the ordinary people of France, Versailles projected an image of divine order and unparalleled magnificence. The official narrative, propagated through commissioned art, poetry, and court-sanctioned publications, was one of a harmonious and brilliant court presided over by a monarch likened to Apollo, the Greek god of the sun. Letters from foreign dignitaries and visitors, such as the German philosopher Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, express a sense of overwhelming awe at the palace's scale, its artistic treasures, and the flawless etiquette of its inhabitants. They saw a perfectly functioning machine of statecraft and culture, the undisputed center of the civilized world. This carefully curated reputation was a powerful diplomatic tool designed to intimidate rivals and solidify France's position as the dominant power in Europe. For those who actually lived within its gilded walls, however, the reality was often far different. The public spectacle of harmony masked a private world of intense rivalry, paranoia, and psychological strain. Louis XIV's sister-in-law, the Princess Palatine Elizabeth Charlotte, captured this duality perfectly in one of her famously frank letters. She wrote, "It is hell for people from the outside, but heaven for those who belong to the court. You are constantly surrounded by spies, and every word you say is reported to the king." This single observation reveals the truth of Versailles. It was a system of total surveillance, where every conversation could be overheard, every relationship scrutinized, and every action interpreted for its political meaning. The splendor was real, but it was the price of admission to a relentless and often brutal competition for royal favor. A visitor's experience of the palace was carefully managed, restricted to the public areas that reinforced the official narrative. They would be guided through the grand sequence of state apartments, marvel at the heroic ceiling paintings in the Hall of Mirrors, and stroll through the geometrically perfect gardens designed by André Le Nôtre. This was the Versailles of public consumption, a theatre of power and order. But the true heart of the palace, the centre of all real influence, was the petit appartement, the king's private chambers. Access to this inner sanctum was the ultimate prize, a privilege granted to only a select few. The physical architecture of the palace thus mirrored its social structure. A vast, magnificent public facade concealing a small, intensely private core where the real business of the kingdom was conducted. The transition from the public world to the private one was a distinct and dramatic moment each night. It occurred after the coucher, the king's public retiring ceremony, which concluded around 11:30. As the last of the authorized nobles departed the king's bedchamber, a profound shift occurred throughout the palace. The thousands of candles that had illuminated the grand halls were extinguished, plunging the public spaces into shadow. The guards at the doors to the state apartments were dismissed or repositioned. The vast majority of the court's 5,000 residents would retire to their own apartments, scattered throughout the immense wings of the building. The noise and color of the public court would fade, replaced by a deep silence, broken only by the footsteps of the sentries patrolling the outer corridors. In this quiet after the performance of the day had ended, the second Versailles would come to life. The palace of public ceremony ceased to exist, and in its place emerged a clandestine world of shadow and intrigue. During the day, the Hall of Mirrors was a sun-drenched corridor for diplomatic processions. After midnight, its mirrored walls reflected only the flickering light of a few scattered candelabra, transforming it into a space for secret encounters. While the formal court slept, a select inner circle summoned by a discreet word from a trusted valet or a subtle gesture made hours earlier would be guided through the now silent halls. They were not heading to the public chambers, but to the king's private apartments, the true nerve center of the forbidden system, where the rules of the day no longer applied. Our understanding of this forbidden system comes not from official court records, which were meticulously sanitized, but from the private, often scathing writings of those who lived within its gilded cage. The most significant of these is the Duc de Saint-Simon, an aristocrat who observed the court with a critical eye and, after the king's death, penned voluminous memoirs. His work, preserved today in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, is a masterpiece of character assassination and political analysis, detailing the mechanics of court life with unparalleled precision. Saint-Simon despised Louis for elevating commoners and legitimizing his bastard children, and his bias permeates every page. Yet, his obsessive documentation of the court's rivalries and scandals provides an indispensable, if jaundiced view into the machinery of power that operated behind the palace's magnificent facade. A second, equally crucial voice belongs to the king's own sister-in-law, Elizabeth Charlotte, the Duchesse d'Orléans, known to the court as the Princess Palatine. Fair German princess transplanted into the heart of French intrigue, she maintained a prolific correspondence with her relatives across Europe. Her letters, uncensored and breathtakingly frank, offer a real-time account of the court's daily life, its moral climate and its endless scandals. Unlike Saint-Simon's retrospective memoirs, her writings capture the immediacy of events as they unfolded. She openly discusses the competition between mistresses, the anxieties of the nobility, and the king's voracious appetites. Her perspective as a high-ranking woman provides a uniquely insightful and often sympathetic counterpoint to Saint-Simon's purely political analysis, giving us a more complete picture of this complex human drama. It is critical, however, to acknowledge that these sources, while invaluable, are not objective historical documents. They are personal accounts colored by grudges, ambitions, and the social conventions of their time. The voices of the most vulnerable participants in this system, the young women without powerful families, the servants who facilitated these encounters, are almost entirely absent from the written record. Therefore, what we know is a reconstruction, pieced together from the gossip, observations, and biased recollections of the elite. We must be clear about what is documented fact versus what is reasoned inference. The full truth in all its detail is likely lost to history, but through these surviving texts, the architecture of the forbidden system becomes terrifyingly clear, revealing a world of calculated intimacy and institutionalized exploitation. This system was not a formal institution with written rules, but a deeply ingrained court culture that began organically and was then perfected as an instrument of rule. It solidified after the court's official move to Versailles in 1682, growing from the king's own well-established practice of taking mistresses. Ambitious noble families, stripped of their traditional military and political power, quickly recognized that the most direct path to the king's favor ran through his bedchamber. The unwritten protocols were universally understood. A woman's beauty and her family's ambition were assets to be deployed strategically. The king's desire was the ultimate political resource, and the competition to capture and hold it became the central, all-consuming occupation of the court, a deadly serious game played for the highest of stakes. The system operated through a sophisticated and discreet network of intermediaries and gatekeepers. An aspiring family would not approach the king directly. That would be a fatal breach of etiquette. Instead, they would work through trusted members of the king's inner circle, his valet, a favored courtier, or most effectively, the current official mistress. The introduction of a new young woman was a carefully orchestrated maneuver, often preceded by a significant political favor or a lavish gift to the intermediary. The initial encounters were shrouded in secrecy, managed through the palace's hidden passages to avoid alerting rivals or offending the queen. Every step was a calculated move in a complex chess match where a single misstep could lead to disgrace and permanent exile from the court. These encounters were not rare, isolated events, but a regular and accepted feature of court life, a constant undercurrent beneath the surface of official ceremony. The king's appetite for novelty was well known, and he often maintained several short-term liaisons simultaneously, even while publicly honoring his official mistress, the maîtresse en titre. The duration of a woman's favor was entirely unpredictable, governed by the king's mercurial affections and her own skill in navigating the treacherous political landscape. A liaison could last a single night or endure for several years, but every woman knew her position was precarious. This constant state of insecurity was a deliberate feature of the system, ensuring that no single faction could ever become too secure or too powerful in its influence over the monarch. Over the decades of his reign, the system evolved from a discreet, personal practice into a semi-official institution of the state. The position of the official royal mistress became a recognized and highly coveted office, complete with its own lavish apartments at Versailles, a dedicated staff, and a substantial pension from the royal treasury. This institutionalization was a masterstroke of political theater. It sent an unambiguous message to the French nobility and to the courts of Europe. The king's personal life and the political life of the kingdom were one and the same. By formalizing the role of his mistress, Louis XIV legitimized sexual intimacy as a valid and essential component of statecraft, transforming his desires into an official instrument of his absolute rule. At the absolute center of this universe was Louis XIV himself, the ultimate arbiter of fortune and fate. His motivations were a complex fusion of genuine personal desire, a deeply ingrained belief in his divine right to possess anyone or anything he wished, and a cold, calculating political pragmatism. He understood that by making access to his person the ultimate prize, he could control the ambitions of his most powerful subjects. He used his affections to test loyalty, to reward obedience, and, most importantly, to sow division and jealousy among the great noble houses. By keeping them in a state of constant, anxious competition for his favor, he ensured they could never unite in conspiracy against the throne, exorcising the ghosts of the Fronde once and for all. The most visible and willing participants were the women of the high aristocracy and their ambitious families. For a noble house with a beautiful daughter, but dwindling finances or political influence, presenting her at court was a high-stakes investment. The potential return was immense. Ducal titles, vast land grants, lucrative military commissions for brothers and sons, and staggering wealth. Families would groom their daughters from a young age, training them in dance, music, and the art of conversation, all skills necessary to capture and hold the king's attention. These women were not passive victims, but active players in the game, wielding their intimacy as a weapon in the relentless pursuit of power and advancement for their entire clan. They entered the system with their eyes wide open, fully aware of both the risks and the spectacular rewards. However, to cast all participants as willing is to ignore the brutal reality of absolute power. For countless other women, particularly those from less powerful families or those serving in subordinate roles as ladies-in-waiting, the king's attention was not an opportunity, but a terrifying, unavoidable command. In a world where the king was the law, refusal was not a viable option. To spurn the monarch's advances would mean immediate and catastrophic ruin, not just for the woman herself, but for her entire family. They would be stripped of their positions, their lands confiscated, and their names erased from the court. The line between consent and coercion, so clear to us today, was rendered almost meaningless in a system where one man held the power of life and death over his subjects. An entire ecosystem of facilitators, accomplices, and enablers was essential to the system's smooth operation. This network included high-ranking nobles like the Duc de Vivonne, who curated introductions to curry favor with the king, effectively acting as high-class procurers. It involved the senior ladies-in-waiting, to both the queen and the official mistresses, who would identify suitable candidates and arrange the discreet logistics of a first meeting. Even the king's personal physicians and confessors were complicit, the former tasked with managing the inevitable pregnancies, and the latter with providing spiritual absolution for the king's continuous adultery. This widespread complicity normalized the system, embedding it so deeply into the fabric of court life that it became unremarkable. Beyond the famous mistresses whose names are recorded in history, there existed a vast, unrecorded number of women who were consumed by this machine and then forgotten. These were the so-called one-night queens, young women, often from the minor provincial nobility, brought to the king's bed for a brief period before being quietly discarded. Once the king's fleeting interest had passed, they were swiftly married off to a compliant, often indebted courtier, and dispatched to a remote estate, their silence purchased with a small dowry or a minor title for their new husband. Their brief, often traumatic, moment at the center of power became a dangerous secret, a chapter of their lives that had to be permanently sealed away, leaving them as little more than footnotes in the king's grand narrative. The Hall of Mirrors served as the system's grand public antechamber, the perfect stage for the opening moves of the game. During the evening appartement, its 357 mirrors and thousands of candles created an environment of dazzling, inescapable surveillance. It was a space designed for seeing and being seen. A lingering gaze from the king directed at a particular lady, a subtle nod, a shared smile. These were not trivial gestures. They were public signals, instantly observed, amplified by the mirrors, and decoded by a court fluent in the language of royal favor. The hall was a theater of possibility, where fortunes could be made or broken by a single glance, and where the king could publicly signal his intentions without uttering a single word. As the formal court events concluded and the vast crowds dispersed, the hall underwent a profound transformation. The thousands of candles were reduced to a few scattered candelabra, plunging the immense gallery into a world of shadow and shimmering reflections. It was in this intimate, conspiratorial atmosphere that the real negotiations took place. A trusted valet or a senior courtier would discreetly approach the family of the chosen lady. The king's invitation would be extended in hushed tones. The acceptance was rarely verbal. A silent nod or a brief understanding glance was sufficient. This silent transaction, a masterpiece of unspoken communication, was the critical moment of transition, the point at which a public flirtation was converted into a private assignation, all under the painted gaze of a triumphant king on the ceiling above. During the height of the Marquise de Montespan's power in the late 1670s, this process took on a perverse new dimension. To maintain her own precarious position against younger rivals, Montespan herself often became the system's chief operator. She would identify, select, and present new, beautiful young women to the king. Her strategy was to control the competition by providing it herself, choosing girls she believed were too naive or unintelligent to pose a real threat to her own influence. It was a dangerous and ultimately self-defeating game. She was curating her own obsolescence, a fact that became brutally clear when the king's affections eventually shifted permanently to one of her own protégées, the governess of their children, the future Madame de Maintenon. Once the silent agreement was reached in the Hall of Mirrors, the chosen woman would be spirited away from the public spaces and into the palace's hidden circulatory system. She would be guided by a trusted servant through the dégagements, the network of narrow, unadorned service corridors and secret staircases. This journey was a stark and sudden transition from the opulent public world of gold leaf and marble to the functional, hidden reality of the palace. It was a physical manifestation of her own transition, from a public courtier to a private secret. This was the point of no return. Upon entering these hidden passages, she left the world of courtly rules behind and entered the king's private domain, a realm where his will was the only law that mattered. These private apartments, the petit appartement, were a world away from the grand, intimidating staterooms. They were designed not for spectacle, but for intimacy and secrecy, furnished with rich velvets, plush carpets, and heavy tapestries that muffled all sound. The atmosphere was one of claustrophobic luxury, dominated by a large, ornate bed. Here, the carefully constructed performance of court life was stripped away. The king was not the Sun King, the divine monarch on public display. He was a man in his private chambers. For the woman brought to him, any illusion of agency or power vanished. She was completely isolated, far from the eyes of the court and any potential protectors, entirely subject to the desires and whims of the most powerful man in Europe. The darkest and most desperate dimension of this secret life was brutally exposed by the affair of the poisons, a sprawling criminal investigation that began in 1677 and shook the court to its foundations. Probing a Parisian network of fortune-tellers, alchemists, and poisoners, investigators uncovered a shocking conspiracy that reached into the highest echelons of the aristocracy. It was alleged that numerous courtiers, including the king's own mistress, the Marquise de Montespan, had resorted to purchasing aphrodisiacs, love potions, and even participating in black magic rituals to secure and maintain the king's affections. The scandal revealed the terrifying lengths to which participants in this high-stakes game were willing to go, exposing a rotten core of superstition and criminality beneath the court's glittering surface. Ultimately, this entire system, while serving the king's personal appetites, was primarily a sophisticated tool for political control. By making sexual favor the most effective path to power, Louis XIV deliberately subverted the traditional aristocratic hierarchy based on birthright and lineage. A family of ancient and noble blood could find itself powerless, while a minor house could be elevated to the highest ranks of the kingdom overnight based on a daughter's success. This constant uncertainty kept the entire nobility off balance and intensely focused on internal rivalries. They were so consumed with competing for the king's intimate favor that they had neither the time nor the unity to conspire against the crown, ensuring the king's absolute authority remained unchallenged. The rewards for successfully navigating this treacherous system were tangible, life-altering, and publicly displayed. The family of a favored mistress could expect a torrent of royal patronage. Brothers and fathers received prestigious military commands, lucrative appointments as provincial governors, or bishoprics within the Catholic Church. The family name was elevated with new titles. They were granted vast estates confiscated from less fortunate nobles, and they received enormous pensions paid directly from the state treasury. The Marquise de Montespan's family, for instance, became one of the wealthiest and most influential in France, their entire fortune a direct result of her long and fruitful relationship with the king, a public testament to the system's efficacy. The system also functioned as a powerful instrument of psychological warfare and ritualized humiliation, forcing a proud and powerful duke, a man who considered himself a peer of the realm, to curry favor through the presentation of his wife or daughter was a profound assertion of the king's ultimate dominance. Louis was known to take a particular, cruel pleasure in bestowing his affections on the wife of a nobleman who had displeased him, a public and undeniable demonstration of his absolute power over his subjects' property, their honor, and their very bodies. This was not merely personal score settling. It was a calculated political act, a constant reminder to the aristocracy of their complete and total subjugation to the will of the monarch. While women like Montespan achieved wealth and influence, for many others, the experience was one of deep trauma and exploitation. The king's first great love and official mistress, Louise de la Vallière, serves as a poignant example. By all accounts, she genuinely loved the king, but she was ultimately a pawn in his larger political games. She was forced to endure the public humiliation of his burgeoning affair with her rival Montespan, and was kept at court as a screen for their relationship long after the king's love for her had died. Broken by the cruelty of the system, she eventually fled the court and sought refuge in a Carmelite convent, spending the rest of her life in harsh penance for a world that had used her beauty and then discarded her spirit. When the king's interest inevitably faded, a woman's fall from grace was swift, public, and brutal. The very courtiers who had once begged for her attention would now shun her completely. Her lavish apartments at Versailles would be summarily reassigned, her generous pensions revoked, and her access to the king's presence permanently denied. The most common fate was a hastily arranged marriage to a compliant courtier, followed by a life of effective exile on a remote provincial estate. For many of these women, the psychological toll was devastating. Their entire identity had been constructed around their relationship with the king. Without his gaze upon them, they ceased to exist in the only world that mattered, a tragic and disposable consequence of the forbidden system. The brilliant facade of the Sun King's court first began to crack, not from a political rebellion, but from the dark underworld of 17th-century Paris. In the year 1677, a police investigation into a network of fortune-tellers and poisoners, led by a woman named Catherine Monvoisin, known as La Voisin, uncovered something far more sinister than simple fraud. As investigators from the Paris police force delved deeper, they unearthed a sprawling conspiracy involving the city's elite. Under interrogation, La Voisin and her associates began to confess to providing not just horoscopes, but deadly poisons, aphrodisiacs, and even officiating at blasphemous rituals known as black masses. The scandal, which would become known as the Affair of the Poisons, was a slow-burning fuse, inching its way from the back alleys of Paris directly toward the gilded heart of Versailles, threatening to expose the desperate criminal lengths to which courtiers would go to gain and maintain royal favor. To manage the escalating crisis, Louis XIV established a special tribunal in 1679, the Chambre Ardente, or burning chamber, to investigate and prosecute the accused. Over the next 3 years, this court would hear the testimony of hundreds of individuals, leading to 36 executions. The confessions painted a horrifying picture of the court's secret life, a world where love potions were slipped into the king's wine and curses were placed on rivals. The true crisis erupted when the interrogations reached the highest echelons of the nobility. The name that began to surface with terrifying frequency was that of the king's own official mistress, the Marquise de Montespan. She was accused not only of using aphrodisiacs to secure the king's affection, but of participating in black masses to cement her power, a revelation that threatened to bring the entire edifice of the monarchy into disrepute. The king was now faced with an impossible choice: allow justice to run its course and see the mother of his own legitimized children publicly tried for witchcraft and murder, or intervene and compromise the very law he embodied. He chose the latter. In 1682, just as the investigation was closing in on Montespan and other high-ranking figures, Louis abruptly suspended the proceedings of the Chambre Ardente. He ordered the official records sealed, creating the infamous lettre de cachet that would keep the remaining accused imprisoned without trial for the rest of their lives. According to the Duc de Saint-Simon, the king went even further, personally taking the most incriminating files into his private study and burning them himself. The scandal was not resolved. It was buried, a dark secret entombed by an absolute monarch who placed the stability of his system above all else. Even suppressed, the affair had profound and lasting consequences. The Marquise de Montespan was permanently disgraced. While she was never formally charged, her influence over the king was shattered, and she was slowly eclipsed by her rival, Madame de Maintenon. A deep paranoia settled over the court, As no one could be sure who had been implicated in the secret testimonies, the scandal irrevocably tarnished the image of a divinely ordained and harmonious court, revealing it to be a place of desperate, superstitious, and even murderous ambition. It marked the beginning of the end for the era of the flamboyant, all-powerful official mistress. The king, profoundly shaken by the revelations, began a slow but steady retreat from the overt decadence that had defined the middle years of his reign, a shift that would permanently alter the culture of Versailles. The financial costs of this lifestyle, of which the forbidden system was a central part, were a constant and unsustainable drain on the French state. The system itself was ruinously expensive, with millions of livres spent on pensions, estates, jewels, and titles for mistresses and their families. This expenditure was a microcosm of the larger economic reality of Louis's reign, which was dominated by a series of costly wars, including the Franco-Dutch War and the War of the Spanish Succession. While these wars were the primary driver of the national debt, the visible, unapologetic extravagance of Versailles became a potent symbol of the monarchy's disconnect from the struggles of its people. This perception of moral and financial bankruptcy would fester for decades, creating a deep well of public resentment that would ultimately fuel the revolutionary fervor of 1789. The forbidden system did not end with a single event, but rather faded away, transformed by the king's own personal evolution. The disgrace of Montespan in the wake of the affair of the poisons, coupled with the death of the long-suffering Queen Maria Theresa in 1683, created a profound shift in the king's life. Now in his mid-40s and confronting his own mortality, Louis turned increasingly toward piety. Sometime in late 1683, he entered into a secret marriage with his children's former governess, the devout and discreet Françoise d'Aubigné, Marquise de Maintenon. Under her influence, the atmosphere at Versailles became markedly more sober and outwardly moral. The era of public mistresses and their overt political power was over, replaced by a court that, on the surface at least, adhered to a stricter code of conduct. Louis XIV's reign finally came to an end on the 1st of September, 1715, just days before his 77th birthday. His death was not the result of poison or palace intrigue, but of gangrene, which developed in his left leg. It was a slow and agonizing decline, and in a manner befitting his entire life it was a public spectacle. The court and his doctors gathered in his bedchamber to observe his final days as he methodically arranged the transfer of power. He died as he had lived, the absolute master of his kingdom, his authority unquestioned to his final breath. His reign of 72 years had transformed France into the dominant power in Europe, but it had also left the nation exhausted by war and burdened with a colossal debt, a complex legacy of glory and ruin that would define the century to come. The immediate consequence of the Sun King's death for Versailles was a sudden and profound silence. The court, which had been held captive by the force of his personality for over 50 years, felt an immense sense of liberation. The regent, Philippe d'Orléans, acting for the 5-year-old King Louis XV, immediately abandoned Versailles and moved the entire royal court back to Paris. The magnificent palace, which had been the bustling center of the political world, was left virtually empty, its grand halls falling quiet for the first time in decades. For 7 years it stood as a silent monument to its creator's ambition. Though the court would eventually return, Versailles would never again be the absolute, all-consuming center of power it had been under Louis XIV. The gilded cage had been opened, and its creator's system had effectively died with him. After the death of Louis XIV, the court of France, under the regency of Philippe d'Orléans, immediately fled Versailles as if escaping a prison. The court returned to Paris, and for 7 years the magnificent palace stood nearly empty, its gilded halls echoing with silence. When the young Louis XV came of age in 1722, he moved the court back, but the spirit had changed. He preferred the intimacy of his private apartments to the relentless public theatre his great-grandfather had created. Under his successor, Louis XVI, and his queen, Marie Antoinette, the palace became a symbol not of national glory, but of royal disconnect and extravagant waste. the very system of absolute control that Louis XIV had perfected. Forcing the nobility into a gilded cage had created a monarchy so isolated from its people that it could no longer hear the growing rumble of revolution beyond its perfectly manicured gardens. The storm finally broke on the 6th of October, 1789, when a mob of Parisian market women marched on Versailles and forcibly removed the royal family, who would never return. The palace was systematically stripped, its priceless furniture, art and tapestries sold off at auction to fund the new republic. It languished for decades, narrowly avoiding demolition, used intermittently by Napoleon for state functions, but never as a residence. Its salvation came in 1837, when King Louis-Philippe transformed the decaying royal palace into a public museum dedicated to all the glories of France. This act fundamentally altered its purpose, converting it from a seat of absolute power into a national monument. While this preserved the structure, it also began a process of historical sanitization, reframing the palace as a celebration of French history rather than the instrument of royal subjugation it had once been. Today, the Palace of Versailles is a UNESCO World Heritage Site, managed by a public establishment under the French Ministry of Culture and welcoming nearly 8 million visitors each year. The vast majority of the structure from the Sun King's era remains intact, a testament to its robust construction and extensive restoration campaigns, most notably those funded by American philanthropist John D. Rockefeller, Jr. in the 1920s. Visitors can walk through the opulent King's State apartments, witness the dazzling spectacle of the Hall of Mirrors, and wander the vast geometric gardens designed by André Le Nôtre. The experience is one of overwhelming scale and beauty. Access to the main palace and gardens is granted with a standard ticket, though certain areas, including the more intimate private apartments, often require booking a separate guided tour, preserving a faint echo of the palace's historic division between public spectacle and private access. The central stage of our story, the Hall of Mirrors, remains the palace's star attraction, meticulously restored to its 17th-century splendor. Millions walk its polished floors each year, their reflections captured in the same Venetian glass that once mirrored the silent negotiations of the Forbidden System. The king's private apartments, the petit apartment, are also preserved and accessible on specialized tours. However, the official narrative presented to the public focuses almost exclusively on the architecture, the art, and the official ceremonial functions of these spaces. There are no plaques detailing the system of sexual patronage. Standard audio guides and tours speak of diplomacy and courtly etiquette, but the darker, more complex story of how desire was weaponized as an instrument of state control is a history that is largely absent from the visitor experience, a truth that must be sought in books rather than in the palace itself. The legacy of Versailles is inextricably linked to the French Revolution. The palace's unimaginable cost and the perceived moral corruption of its court became powerful symbols of the old regime's tyranny, fueling the revolutionary fervor that would ultimately dismantle the absolute monarchy Louis XIV had perfected. The Hall of Mirrors itself would later serve as the stage for a profound historical irony. In 1871, the German Empire was proclaimed in the hall after defeating France, and in 1919, the Treaty of Versailles, which officially ended World War I and dismembered that same German Empire, was signed in the very same room. This transforms the hall from a mere monument to a living document of European history, a space that has both witnessed the zenith of absolute power and hosted its final reckoning, a stage for both the creation and destruction of empires. Ultimately, Versailles stands as a complex and troubling monument. It is a masterpiece of art and architecture, yet it was built on a foundation of human suffering and designed as a machine of psychological control. Its history forces us to confront difficult questions about how we remember the past. When we preserve a place of such beauty, do we have an obligation to also preserve the uncomfortable truths of the human exploitation that took place within its walls? The palace reveals how absolute power can corrupt not just politics, but the most intimate aspects of human life, transforming desire into a currency and people into pawns. The story of Versailles is not just about a king and his palace. It is a timeless lesson on the seductive and dangerous relationship between beauty, power, and the high price of glory, a lesson that continues to resonate through the centuries. Versailles stands today as a breathtaking monument to French glory, a masterpiece of art and architecture that continues to inspire awe. Yet behind its shimmering facade of gold and mirrors lay a meticulously engineered system of human control where desire was weaponized and lives were traded for political advantage. The palace was both a work of genius and a gilded cage. This forces us to ask a difficult question. Was this forbidden system a brilliant, if ruthless tool of statecraft, a necessary evil to domesticate a dangerous aristocracy and forge a modern state? Or was it simply the personal depravity of a king whose absolute power allowed him to indulge his appetites without consequence? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you appreciate these deep dives into the complex truths behind the world's greatest monuments, please subscribe for more. Thank you for watching.